There are stories you stumble upon that don't feel real at first. They sound like whispers from an old folktale, the kind you would expect to find in a yellowed newspaper clipping buried in the back of a forgotten archive. But this one was horrifyingly real. A man who did the unthinkable. He raised his own daughter not as a child, but as a wife, and the secret lingered in shadows for decades until fragments of the truth began to surface. Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. Before this story pulls you in too deep, hit subscribe and tap the bell icon so you don't miss more buried histories like this one. Now, imagine a family isolated from the world, tucked away in a countryside house with no neighbors close enough to intervene. This man, at first, appeared like any other widower, broken by tragedy, left to care for his only child. To outsiders, it seemed like a sad but ordinary story. But behind closed doors, the child was not being raised like other daughters. Slowly, subtly, the father began shaping her life not as a caretaker would, but as someone preparing her for a role she could never consent to. By the time she grew into a teenager, the relationship no longer resembled father and daughter. It had transformed into something sinister, hidden in plain sight. The town whispered, but no one dared to confront him. Families kept their distance. Children were warned not to wander near the property. And yet, when the truth finally cracked open, the details revealed something far worse than rumors. This wasn't just an isolated act of cruelty. It exposed a dark tradition that had roots in generations of secrecy, where isolation and taboo blurred the lines of morality. The father wasn't the first in his bloodline to cross such boundaries, and tragically he wouldn't be the last. The story forces us to ask, how many of these hidden lives went unnoticed in America's forgotten towns? How many daughters, sons, and wives bore the weight of truths too unspeakable to reach the light? And the deeper you dig, the more unsettling it becomes. Because the past has a way of repeating itself, and the scars of one generation can bind the next in a cycle of silence. To understand the darkness of this story, we have to look at the beginning, at the man himself. He wasn't born into kindness or gentleness. His own childhood was marked by silence, bruises, and secrets nobody spoke of. Raised in a household where women were possessions and children were burdens, he learned early that cruelty was normal and control was power. Neighbors later recalled that he was a man of few words, someone who rarely smiled but always watched. He had an unsettling presence, the kind that made people shift uneasily when he walked into a room. His eyes never seemed to look at you, but through you, as though searching for something you didn't want him to find. When tragedy struck and he lost his wife, the townsfolk whispered pity. A widower raising a daughter alone, what a heavy cross to bear. But sympathy soon girdled into suspicion. He didn't allow visitors into the home. The curtains were always drawn, and the girl, his only daughter, was rarely seen outside. When she did appear, her posture was strange, her smile unnerving. Some said she seemed less like a child and more like a shadow, rehearsed in every movement, as though she were being trained for a role. The father, meanwhile, carried himself with a chilling confidence. He spoke of family like it was sacred, but in his voice lingered an obsession. He told stories of bloodlines, purity, and the dangers of outsiders. To him, the world beyond his home was corrupt, and only within his walls could truth survive. But his truth was twisted, shaped by his own scars and a generational curse no one dared to confront. By the time the girl reached adolescence, she was no longer seen at all. Locals wondered if she'd been sent away, or if something darker had happened. Some nights, lights flickered in the upstairs windows, and neighbors swore they heard faint music, an old waltz, played over and over as though someone was rehearsing a dance with invisible partners. The truth was far more chilling. Behind those locked doors, he was transforming his daughter into something no one in the outside world could recognize. She was being erased as a child and rewritten into a role she never chose. The wife he decided she must become. The longer he kept his daughter hidden, the more the town began to whisper. In places like this, secrets rarely stay buried forever. The grocery clerk remembered the way the man would buy 2 of everything. 2 pairs of women's shoes, 2 sets of jewelry-sized trinkets, though there was no wife in his home. The tailor said he once saw him purchase a delicate white dress, the kind meant for weddings, not funerals. People began to ask questions, but never to his face. His presence was too intimidating, his temper too unpredictable. When he walked down the street, even grown men looked the other way. It wasn't just fear of his size or his voice. It was the sense that he knew something about you that you didn't want revealed, that he collected secrets the way others collected coins. One evening, a neighbor boy claimed he saw something through the upstairs window, a shadow of 2 figures moving slowly in a dance, their hands clasped, their bodies close in a way that didn't belong to a father and child. When he told his parents, they scolded him for making up ghost stories, but the boy swore it wasn't his imagination, and the thought of it lodged in the back of people's minds like a splinter that would never heal. The daughter's absence from school was excused with forged letters. "She's unwell," they said. "She studies at home." And yet, when she was glimpsed in the yard, her face told a different story. She never looked up when spoken to, never smiled, and never moved without his silent permission. Some swore her eyes seemed older than her years, as if childhood had been stolen from her long before its time. The town grew uneasy. What they feared most wasn't what they suspected, but what they might confirm if they asked too many questions. In that silence, the man's power grew. He had built not just a prison for his daughter, but a fortress of fear around himself, protected by the cowardice of neighbors who preferred to look away. And so, behind those drawn curtains and locked doors, the rehearsal of a nightmare continued. She was not his child anymore. She was becoming the role he demanded, the wife no one else would ever claim. The line between father and husband blurred until it vanished entirely. He no longer spoke of her as my daughter to the few who dared visit. Instead, he would slip, referring to her as she belongs to me or my companion. Those who overheard would shift uncomfortably, convincing themselves they had misheard. But deep down, they knew they hadn't. The girl's body told its own story. She was still young, but her posture sagged with the exhaustion of someone twice her age. Her once neat hair became brittle, her complexion pale from rarely seeing sunlight. On her finger a thin ring appeared, too large, clearly not made for her, but worn nevertheless. It was said to be his mother's wedding band, a relic twisted into a chain binding her to him. One night, during a rare storm, neighbors reported hearing muffled cries that rose above the thunder. They described it as neither a scream of pain nor of fear, but something stranger, like a plea smothered before it could fully escape. The storm became an excuse. It must have been the wind, people told themselves. But afterward, no one in town could look at the girl the same way. Soon after, she disappeared from view altogether. No more glimpses in the yard, no shadow at the window, nothing but silence. He claimed she was ill, bedridden, in need of care only he could provide. But whispers spread like rot. Had she grown old enough to resist him? Or worse, had she borne a secret no one dared name? The church avoided him, the doctor refused to call, and yet the house stood like a monument to something everyone knew, but no one spoke aloud. To confront it would mean confronting their own silence, their own guilt for letting it happen. Inside, the man tightened his control. The girl had nowhere to run. To the world, she was gone. To him, she was everything. A possession, a wife in all but name, and a daughter forever bound. It was the kind of story no one would believe unless they saw it, and by then it would be too late. The truth was beginning to bleed through the cracks, and the town, for all its willful blindness, could no longer keep the darkness buried. By the time the girl reached what most would call adulthood, her presence in town had become nothing more than a memory. People whispered about her, as if she were already dead, though she was very much alive, hidden, confined, consumed. The man had reshaped her life into something unrecognizable, binding her tighter with every year that passed. Occasionally, an old friend of the family would ask, "How is she?" But the man's answers were vague. "She's fine," he'd say, with a smile too forced to be convincing. Then he would change the subject, his eyes warning against further inquiry. Those who pushed too far soon stopped visiting altogether. A sickness seemed to follow anyone who came too close. And yet, the truth left its mark in subtle, haunting ways. A merchant swore he once saw the girl at the edge of the property, her figure barely visible through the fog. She didn't wave, didn't call for help, but her face, pale, drawn, and almost unrecognizable, carried an expression so broken it was impossible to forget. It wasn't the face of a wife, the merchant said later, but of someone who knew she was trapped forever. Rumors grew more grotesque with every retelling. Some said the man had forced a child upon her, though no such child was ever seen. Others whispered she had grown mad, unable to bear the unbearable, locked away in some upper room with boarded windows. A few even suggested that the man had convinced her this life was normal, that he had erased her sense of self so completely she no longer knew what freedom was. The townsfolk, bound by fear and shame, became silent accomplices. No law came, no minister intervened. The house became a symbol of the rot that festers when secrets are allowed to live unchecked. The deeper the silence, the stronger the curse. Years passed this way, the girl a ghost in her own lifetime, the man growing older, yet no less possessive. And though whispers of his sins swirled, no one dared bring them into the open. It was as if the entire community had chosen to bury her existence, just as he had buried her life. But darkness has a way of seeping out, and soon the walls of silence would tremble. What was hidden in one home could not stay confined forever. Time has a way of loosening secrets, no matter how tightly they are bound. The man grew older, weaker, and with his decline came cracks in the careful story he had built. People who had avoided the house for decades noticed strange movements in the yard again. Flickers of a woman wandering after dusk, her form bent, her steps slow, as if she carried the weight of a life stolen from her. One account tells of a traveling preacher who stopped in the town and insisted on visiting the house after hearing the rumors. When the door opened, he claimed he was met not by one figure, but by two: the old man, rigid and hostile, and the woman whose face bore no joy, no will, only resignation. Her eyes, the preacher later wrote in his private journal, were the eyes of someone who had lived half her life buried alive. Whispers became harder to contain. A young boy, emboldened by curiosity, crept too close one summer and swore he heard crying from the upstairs window. Another villager insisted they saw a second, smaller bed through a crack in the shutters, though none could confirm if a child lived or had ever lived inside. What made the story most disturbing was not the crime itself, but the silence surrounding it. The town knew. Families had spoken of it in hushed voices at their table. Children grew up warned never to walk near the house. Ministers skipped it during their sermons. Yet no one ever raised their voice. It was easier to pretend she didn't exist. Easier to let her life bleed away behind those rotting walls. The old man seemed to thrive on that silence. Each year, he grew more paranoid, yet more defiant, daring anyone to confront him. And when death finally crept close, some said he boasted to a neighbor, "No one ever stopped me, not once." The woman, still cloaked in shadows, remained after he passed. And though the house stood, its silence became unbearable. Neighbors reported strange sounds at night, the soft sob of a woman, or worse, a lullaby sung to no one. They said she had become a hollow figure, trapped so long in captivity that even freedom could not save her. It was here, at the edge of truth and legend, that the darkest family secret in America began to feel less like rumor and more like a haunting that would never leave. The death of the man should have ended the story, but in truth, it was only the beginning of its legend. The woman, whose life had been stolen, lingered on in that crumbling house as though she had nowhere else to go. Some say she refused to leave because she didn't know how to exist outside of its walls. Others believed she stayed because she was too ashamed to face a world that had turned its back on her for so long. Years later, travelers passing through the region claimed they caught sight of her, an older figure now, wandering the fields in silence, her hair disheveled, her dress tattered. Children whispered that she was not alive at all, but a ghost who had remained because her suffering had never been acknowledged. To this day, a handful of locals insist that the windows of the house sometimes glow faintly at night, as though she is still inside, waiting for someone to remember her. Historians who dared to research the case found little recorded in official documents. Court records were silent, newspapers barely mentioned it, and the community swore it was nothing more than a rumor. But scattered letters and journals suggested otherwise. Each fragment of testimony painted the same unsettling picture: a daughter forced into the role of a wife, her childhood stolen, her identity erased, her life turned into something unrecognizable. And yet, what makes this story most haunting is not only the act itself, but how a whole town allowed it to happen. Everyone looked away. Everyone let silence bury the crime. It is a silence that echoes even now, a reminder that the darkest secrets are not just the sins of individuals, but the sins of entire communities that chose to keep quiet. The house still stands, though rotting deeper each year, Those who walk by say the air feels heavier there, colder, as if the soil itself remembers what it was forced to conceal. And whether you believe in ghosts or not, the truth remains. A scar was left, and no one has ever fully spoken it aloud. Perhaps that is why the story still lingers, because history refuses to stay buried.